de soutenir son combat. Aujourd'hui, la résistance mène un nouveau combat qui vise à traduire en justice les auteurs du massacre de 30 000 personnes qui s'est déroulé en 1988 en Iran. La publication d'une vidéo postée par le fils de l'ayatollah Montazeri en 2015 a dévoilé l'ampleur de ce massacre et a révélé la participation de ses auteurs à un comité nommé la Commission de la mort, chargé d'organiser ces crimes. Ces gens faisaient partie du gouvernement de Hassan Rouhani. Dans cette vidéo, les membres de la Commission de la mort admettent que nombreux sont les moudjahidines qui attendent encore aujourd'hui en Iran d'être exécutés et dont les membres de leur famille ont déjà été exécutés en 1988. Certains d'entre eux n'avaient même pas 15 ans au moment de leur arrestation. Les propos de Montazeri fournissent des preuves convaincantes pour ouvrir, à mon sens, une procédure juridique et en finir avec l'impunité des responsables du massacre de 1988. Un crime contre l'humanité. J'attire donc l'attention de la communauté internationale, en particulier du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies et du Conseil des droits de l'homme, à l'impératif de renvoyer cette affaire devant le tribunal international pénal, qui est pertinent en cette compétence. Nous ne pouvons pas rester indifférents face à ce massacre de 1988, un des plus importants depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Ici, aujourd'hui, les Nations Unies nous rappellent que ces actes violent ces principes fondamentaux et fondateurs, les droits de l'homme, la paix et surtout la démocratie. Dans l'esprit des conventions de Genève, que ma ville a l'honneur de symboliser, nous soutenons donc votre démarche, mesdames et messieurs. Nous sommes et nous serons toujours aux côtés de la résistance iranienne. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you for this very nice introduction and also summary of everything that this session will be about. As the next speaker, I want to introduce Mr. Taher Boumehra, who is a former advisor to the UN SRSG in Iraq and the former chief of the Human Rights Section of UNAMI.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I had the opportunity to be working with the United Nations in Baghdad, and I was witnessed on the ground a number of very disturbing situations of violation of human rights in Iraq, but not only by the Iraqi government, but by the intervention of the Iranian regime. And you know very well that there are special institutions organized in order to achieve this interference in the neighboring states. Besides the guards, the revolutionary guards who commit untold crimes against their own people. Now, I would like to focus on the role of the United Nations, because when the Ashrafis were persecuted and indeed slaughtered in Camp Ashraf, the United Nations used to use me to go and do the body count. And then they would issue a general statement requesting an independent inquiry. And there would be no follow-up on this request. And when I was following up on these issues as the chief of the Human Rights Office, the UNAMI, I was told, why do you want to revive a forgotten issue? So my fear today is that the same thing will happen with these governmental institutions, where states will cover up for friendly states, where there will be trade horses, or horse trading rather, about human rights, the values of the United Nations, and political expedience. So this is why I think it's still time for us to call for an independent inquiry, probing into these massacres that took place not only in 1988, but from the time the Khomeini regime took power till today. And you know very well that Iran is one of the countries that execute most, and they even went as far as issuing a special letter to the United Nations telling them that we will not accept a moratorium on death penalty. It's one of the very few states in the United Nations that issued this letter. So it's clear the government of Iraq will never cooperate on any inquiry. And it's clear that a consensus among states, members of the Human Rights Council, is very difficult to achieve. And also it's clear that even in New York, in General Assembly, it's quite difficult to achieve any consensus on this issue, whether in the Security Council or in the General Assembly. So I think it's left to the civil society, the NGOs, to play their full role in first making the international community aware of the scale of these massacres that took place and still taking place, and also making the international community be aware that there will never be an independent inquiry without the effective work of the civil society and the NGOs. And it's really our role to make sure that the United Nations will play its role regardless of the interest of the states members of this organization. So the reality is that the evidence actually existed about the crimes that took place, particularly in the summer of 1988, are there, and it's very difficult to question them. And with the latest revelations on the issue, it became clear that a crime against humanity actually did take place, and it's still taking place. The United Nations has recently renewed its agencies, its organs, its procedures, and I think the United Nations should take this opportunity to regain, rebuild its credibility in terms of addressing issues of human rights. There will be very soon some changes in New York. There are some changes here in Geneva. New procedures have been put in place. And I really think that it's time now for the civil society to put pressure on the United Nations, special procedures and other specialized organs to play their role fully in probing the situation prevailing in Iraq. I say that, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you did a very valid point there, saying that this is not only something that happened 28 years ago in 1988, this is something that is currently occurring. And only recently, the Iraqi government executed 25 Sunni prisoners in mass execution, and it's actually performed by the same governing officials sitting today. So it's not only something that happened 28 years ago, it's still occurring. As the next speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Alejo Vidal-Quadras. He is the Vice President of the European Parliament and the President of the International Committee in Search of Justice.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this meeting. I was, in fact, Vice President of the European Parliament since 1999 until 2014, so 15 years in total, but I'm not at the moment, so I'm former Vice President of the European Parliament. During my years in the European Parliament, together with other colleagues, we formed an international platform that we call In Search of Justice International Committee to support the struggle of the Iranian resistance in the courts of justice in the United States, in Europe, to be removed from the blacklist. This international platform was supported by thousands of parliamentarians from both sides of the Atlantic. Today is an NGO, a think tank, based in Brussels with the name of In Search of Justice International Committee. And we have produced in recent times several reports on different matters, on the Iranian nuclear program, on the political analysis of the conflict in the Middle East, on the Iranian elections. But I want to refer to one report that you can read in our website that we have published very recently, in the month of August. On the 16th of August, we at the IAJ International Committee produced a comprehensive report on the audio file that records a conversation that the late Grand Ayatollah Montazeri had with some members of the so-called death committee that was in charge of executing the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners belonging to the organization, the PMOI, the People's Movement of Iran. It must be remembered that Montazeri was, at that time, number 2 of the Iranian regime. He was the successor, appointed successor of Ayatollah Khomeini. This massacre was executed by order of Ayatollah Khomeini with a fatwa. These people were hanged in the period of a couple of months, 30,000 people. They were buried in mass graves, and the families were unable to grieve for their loved ones. The conversation of Ayatollah Montazeri, that has been, as I say, published, on the record, is a conversation of about 40 minutes with 3 of these members of the Death Committee. It must be said that these were 3 members of the Death Committee of Tehran, because there were similar committees in different provinces of Iran. That was the Tehran Death Committee. And the conversation is very dramatic. Ayatollah Montazeri expresses his rejection of his horror for this massacre, for this crime, and he asks the executioners to stop the killings, and he says, in a certain moment of the conversation, this is the biggest crime that we have seen in contemporary history of Iran. It must be said that Ayatollah Montazeri had no sympathy for the PMOI. He was part of the regime. He was number 2 of Khomeini. So his testimony is really meaningful, because a man of the regime expresses his horror in front of this massacre. By the way, it is interesting to note that one of the 3 people that speak to Montazeri in this conversation today is the Minister of Justice of the Islamic Republic of Iran. After this opposition of Ayatollah Montazeri to the massacre, he was dismissed, he was dispossessed of all his titles, he was humiliated by Khomeini, and he was put under home arrest until his death. That was in 2009. So he paid a very high price. In the same way, his son, that made public this audio tape, is paying today the consequences of his love for truth. Let me emphasize very briefly a few points. The first point is that Khomeini's fatwa of killing members and supporters of PMOI, well, I said killing, I should say exterminating them, leaves no doubt that he ordered a crime against humanity. Therefore, all the people who had a role in implementing this decree, this fatwa, were also involved in a crime against humanity. The second point is that this massacre, this genocide, did not stop in 1988. In fact, it continues until today. Very recently, on the 2nd of August, 25 Sunni political prisoners were hanged. So this killing machine, that is the Iranian regime, is still working. The third point is that the same officials in charge of the 1988 massacre are still at the top of the Islamic Republic. They are involved in the suppression and destruction of all opposition, all democratic, peaceful opposition inside the Iranian society. These people include poor Mohammadi, that, as I said before, is now the Minister of Justice. But it must be said that Mr. Poor Mohammadi, the Minister of Justice, has stated these days he's very proud of having organized and executed a massacre of 30,000 defenseless people that were arrested, prisoners in that time. He's proud. We all have heard that the Western governments are very happy because now in Iran there is a moderate government because Rouhani won the election, so the moderate won the elections. So a moderate government where sit criminals against humanity is a strange concept of moderation, at least under my point of view. And of course, we have called for the 1988 massacre to be on the agenda of the current Human Rights Council. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights must issue a call for an investigation in this regard. The upcoming session of the General Assembly in New York in October must issue a resolution and call for an investigation into this massacre and refer its dossier to the Security Council. We also urge the UN Security Council to form an international tribunal, international court, to examine this case and prosecute those that were responsible for this crime against humanity. And let me conclude by asking all of you, including those that probably are watching this meeting live on TV or internet, to make sure that the sacrifice of these 30,000 political prisoners who were brutally hanged will be remembered, will not be forgotten, and that the criminals who are ruling Iran today will be prosecuted and brought to justice. In that sense, I want to end this intervention saying that we urge Western governments to condition their relationship with Iran to a suspension and halt of executions.
Thank you. I also want to repeat what Mr. Dad just said earlier, that you have to read this ISJ report that is on the website. It's very comprehensive and it has attached evidence that is translated into English from see it or any other languages. So if you haven't read it, please do. It's very good. The next speaker along the list is Ingrid Betancourt. She is a politician and Colombian presidential candidate, former Colombian presidential candidate.
I would like first to thank you all for joining us. We are a group of people from many perspectives and experiences of life, people from NGOs, victims and survivors of this massacre, lawyers, members of human rights defenders and NGOs, and as myself, a victim and I would say also a survivor from terrorist events and crimes. And it is as such that it has become for us absolutely relevant to end impunity and to make sure that the people that were responsible for these crimes are brought to justice. We have been asked why it took us so long to react. 28 years after that massacre is a lot of time. The answer is that it's never too late to do well. And it is true that the road has been a winding one, but we're now seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. First, you need perhaps to know that bringing to the public opinion of these events has been done previously by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, which in years before have pointed out about this massacre and have called for investigation on this particular matter. In this house, some years ago, there was a testimony from, very relevant to this case. It was an Iranian man that was working in a cemetery in Iran. And he was a visual witness of how, in the month of August 1988, to this cemetery, trucks that came from the government of Iran arrived to his cemetery, loaded with hundreds of bodies of corpses of people that were then dumped into mass graves. The horror of the scene, and this is a picture that you can access, is that there were so many dead people into these mass graves that the dirt they poured in to try to cover the bodies was not enough. And they left the mass graves with hands and faces sticking out from the dirt as a vivid proof of the brutality and the absolute inhumanity of what was happening at that moment. Those testimonies of people that were looking and couldn't say anything about what was happening is today relayed by the victims. Some of them, very few, 4, perhaps 5, women and men, survived this horror. They are now, today, they are part of this committee that we have put together, and they bring their testimony of what happened, on how these executions went on on the absence of trial. Do we have to state it again? Perhaps it doesn't matter. But the fact is that these people were executed after having been tried and sentenced to sentences that they were paying at that moment in jail. So it's not only the injustice of the system, it's also the sheer brutality and absence of humanity of what went on. In those very few months, to make a comparison, just for us to understand, and at least is the one I gave to myself to try to understand what happened. In Argentina, some years before, there were 30,000 people killed by the dictatorship, the military dictatorship at the time, during a span of a decade. These people have been prosecuted. It took time, but they are now in jail. Here we have 30,000 people that were killed in a month. Just do the maths. How many people do they have to kill a day to obtain that number? And even if we don't want to be light or to have an easy kind of explanation, we cannot avoid thinking on how they had to organize the crime. And immediately, we have to think of what happened in the Second World War with the final solution. How people were picked up in the cities in Europe because they were from a certain religion. How they were forced to embark in trains. How they were then taken to camps and how they were killed. Because for me, this is very simple. These people were picked up because not only their political stand, but also because of their faith. These people were Muslim, but they were Muslims of another genre. They thought that you could be Muslim being a Democrat, that you could be Muslim respecting gender equality, that you could be Muslim rejecting death penalty, that you could be Muslim respecting the rights of people to think in politics as they wished. These people, because they were Muslims, but because they were another kind of Muslims, were manslaughter into a genocide that has no comparison in the history of Iran. I want you to think, just for a second, what would be of the world today if this hadn't happened? What would be of the reflection we have today on the problem of terrorism linked to religious fundamentalism if these 30,000 people would have been allowed to expose and defend their view of another type of way of being Muslim? And of course, for me, it is so obvious that what has happened in Iran is happening today, not only in Iran, but has been exported to the world, and especially to our neighborhoods. And it's because I make the link with the massacre in 1988 and the bombs in Paris, in Nice, in Brussels, the attacks, the terrorist attacks all over the world, in the States too, that I have to be very firm in asking all of you to help us bring these people that are in office, that have responsibilities, that are part of a government taking decisions today, in order that we can prevent that what happened in 1988